There is a version of Harrison Ford's life where none of this happens, where the carpentry work stays steady enough, where the small television roles keep not amounting to anything, where a director casting a low-budget science fiction film uses someone else to feed lines to the other auditionees. Because the carpenter who happened to be working in the building that day had already gone home. That version of events was entirely plausible in 1976. Harrison Ford was 33 years old. He had a wife, 2 sons, a house in Los Angeles, and a career that had never quite decided what it was. He wasn't failing, he was just pending. The man who would become one of the most recognizable humans on the planet was installing cabinets for a living, and wondering if the acting thing was ever actually going to resolve itself. And here is what makes his story different from every other nobody to somebody story Hollywood has ever produced. He never quite became comfortable with the somebody part. At 83, what Harrison Ford has finally been willing to say about his marriages, his choices, and the life that ran underneath 50 years of global fame is quieter, stranger, and more honest than anything the myth of him ever suggested. This is that story. From the beginning. Los Angeles in the early 1960s was still a city that could absorb a struggling actor without much notice. Harrison Ford arrived in it. Not with ambition exactly, but with a kind of stubborn determination that didn't know yet what it was determined toward. He took acting roles where he could find them. Small television parts. Scenes that didn't add up to anything. A contract with Columbia Pictures that led to minimal work and then release. When acting didn't pay the bills, he picked up a hammer. Carpentry became his trade. A real one. Not a hobby, not a fallback, but a genuine skill he developed and sold to homeowners and industry professionals across Los Angeles. He worked on the houses of musicians and producers. He learned the specific satisfaction of making something that holds. In 1964, before any of this had resolved itself, he married a woman named Mary Marquardt. This is important to understand. That marriage was not a Hollywood marriage. There were no red carpets, no profiles, no industry couples branding around it. It was a domestic partnership built in financial uncertainty, between 2 people figuring out an ordinary life. Their son Benjamin was born in 1966, their second son Willard in 1969. And Harrison Ford continued to oscillate. Job sites in the morning, audition rooms in the afternoon, home to a family in the evening that had no reason to expect any of this was about to change. His appearance in American Graffiti in 1973 gave him brief visibility, not recognition. Visibility. There is a difference. What it gave him, more importantly, was proximity to George Lucas, a director who would remember him when the next project came around. Ford has described the period honestly. He was a carpenter who happened to be working in the right building at the moment someone needed him to read lines. Star Wars was not, in 1976, a sure thing. It was a high-risk science fiction film with budget pressure, a skeptical studio, scripts being rewritten during production, and a director who was known more for smaller character-driven work than for anything at this scale. Harrison Ford was not cast as Han Solo through a conventional audition. He was in the building, working, when Lucas needed someone to read lines opposite the actors who were actually auditioning. What happened in that room is what changed everything. The rhythm Ford brought to Han Solo, the sarcasm, the grounded delivery, the improvisational energy that made the character feel like he didn't entirely believe in the world he was inhabiting, reframed the role in real time. Lucas kept bringing him back. The role became his. Filming took place at Elstree Studios in England and on location in Tunisia. Scripts continued to shift. The tone was still unclear. Nobody on that production was confident they were making something important. Harrison Ford was 33, married, father of 2, a carpenter who had just been handed a role in a film that the studio itself wasn't sure it wanted to release. And somewhere in those months of filming, in the specific atmosphere of uncertainty and isolation that long productions create, something happened that he would not fully address publicly for nearly 40 years. Carrie Fisher was 19 years old, newly cast as Princess Leia, freshly arrived in a foreign country on a production she didn't fully understand, navigating sudden attention and long hours in an unfamiliar environment. She kept a diary. In 2016, 4 decades later, she published it. The Princess Diarist landed in December 2016 and immediately became something neither Ford nor Fisher had fully anticipated. Not a scandal, exactly, but a reckoning. Fisher did not write about the relationship as a love story. She wrote about it as a 19-year-old's emotional experience, intense, consuming, disorienting, filtered through the perspective of a woman looking back from her 60s at who she had been in a foreign country on a film set that felt like its own universe. She described becoming intensely infatuated with Ford. She described the diary entries as a reconstruction of feelings she had at the time, not a definitive account of what those feelings meant to both people involved. She told Ford ahead of publication that she intended to include the material. His response, by her account, included the word lawyer. When the book came out, Ford was asked about it directly. He said it felt strange. When asked if he had read the memoir, he said, "No, I didn't," and beyond that, he declined to go further. That response is worth taking seriously. not as evasion but as consistency. Harrison Ford has never, in 50 years of being one of the most interviewed humans on the planet, been the person who elaborates on his private life for public consumption. He didn't deny Fisher's account. He didn't confirm it with enthusiasm. He described the experience of the revelation with one word and then withdrew. That is who he has always been. Fisher died in December 2016. Within weeks of the memoir's publication, Ford issued a brief statement describing her as brilliant and fearless. He did not revisit the subject after that. His first marriage to Mary Marquardt ended in 1979, 3 years after Star Wars wrapped, 2 years after it changed everything. He has never publicly blamed the Fisher situation for that ending. What the timeline shows is not causation but simultaneity. Between 1976 and 1979, his career accelerated beyond any previous version of his life, and the domestic structure that had been built for the ordinary version of that life did not survive the transition. That is its own kind of truth, even without a confession. By 1981, Harrison Ford was no longer pending. Raiders of the Lost Ark, directed by Steven Spielberg, produced by George Lucas, filmed across Tunisia, England, and Hawaii, became the highest-grossing film of that year in the United States and earned 9 Academy Award nominations. It also created a second iconic character that locked Ford's status as one of the defining movie stars of his generation. Where Han Solo had been a reluctant rogue in space, Indiana Jones was something different, physical, grounded, tied to history and adventure in a way that felt almost literary. Ford did many of his own stunts, endured real injuries on set, added to the perception that whatever his stardom was, it had been earned rather than manufactured. In 1983, he married Melissa Matheson. This is the marriage that deserves more careful attention than it typically receives in profiles of Harrison Ford, because Matheson was not a peripheral figure in his life or in the culture they both operated inside. She wrote E.T. the Extraterrestrial. That film grossed over $790 million worldwide. It became one of the defining works of that decade. Their marriage was a meeting of two people at the peak of what they were each capable of, and it lasted 17 years. They had 2 children, Malcolm, born in 1987, and Georgia, born in 1990. The separation came in 2000. The divorce was finalized in 2004. No public drama, no defining rupture, no scandal. Just the slow, quiet accumulation of distance that can happen when 2 people spend years on separate professional trajectories and find, eventually, that the trajectory home has become unclear. Melissa Matheson died in November 2015 from neuroendocrine cancer. She was 65 years old. Ford did not speak publicly at length about that loss. The timeline, however, the end of the marriage, the years between, her death, marked the closing of the longest and perhaps most significant chapter of his adult life. Here is what Harrison Ford has never done. He has never written a memoir. He has never done a long-form confessional interview. He has never used his platform to reframe his past in favorable terms. He has never turned his personal history into a narrative that serves his public image. What he has done, consistently across 5 decades, is show up for the work and protect everything else. 3 marriages, 4 biological children, 1 adopted son, a relationship with Carrie Fisher that existed for 3 months in 1976 and became, through no choice of his, a piece of permanent Hollywood history 40 years after it ended. An affair he never confirmed and never denied. A first marriage that ended during the transition from nobody to everybody. A second marriage to one of the most quietly significant figures in American cinema that ended without a public word about why. A third chapter, slower, more deliberate, built for a version of life that didn't need the world watching. At 83, what Harrison Ford has finally said is not, in truth, a dramatic confession. It is something more specific. It is the accumulated honesty of a man who never performed his inner life for public consumption, and who has, by simply continuing to be that way across 5 decades, said more about who he actually is than any memoir ever could. The Millennium Falcon is now on display at a museum. The fedora is somewhere in a prop archive. The carpenter from Queens is still here, still not particularly interested in explaining himself. Which, come to think of it, is the most Harrison Ford thing imaginable. Drop a comment below which era of his career or personal life did you know least about going in. Subscribe if you're new. See you in the next one.